Mr. President, on December 11th of last year, at a meeting at the White House, President Trump said he would be, quote, proud to shut down the government of the United States if he didn't get things 100% his way. And then, 11 days later, on December 22nd, President Trump shut down the government. We are now 32 days into the longest government shutdown in the history of the United States. And I say to President Trump, that is nothing to be proud of. The damage is growing by the day in every part of our country and across different sectors of our economy. It's estimated that the partial government shutdown is now costing the economy $6 billion every week. 800,000 federal employees are going without pay, and this coming Friday will mark the second full pay period in which they get pay stubs with a big fat goose egg on them. Hundreds of thousands of those federal employees are working every day without pay, and hundreds of thousands of them have been locked out of work and want to get back to doing the business of the American people, but are prohibited from doing so because of the government shutdown. And as a result of their inability to go to work, there are tens of millions of our fellow Americans who are losing access to vital government services. There's nothing to be proud of in shutting out a whole sector of service contract employees and small businesses that provide support services to the federal government. I'm going to go into a little more detail in a moment, but small businesses around this country that depend on the Small Business Administration for loans or because they do business with the federal government are getting absolutely clobbered. That is nothing to be proud of, Mr. President. It's not anything to be proud of that so many federal employees are not able to make their rent or mortgage payments or the monthly tuition installment payments for their children's college education or for other provisions they want to provide for their family. Now, sadly, this Senate is complicit in the shutdown. Let me actually rephrase that. The majority in this Senate is complicit in the shutdown because we have not been allowed a vote on two bills that are on the Senate calendar that we could vote on today and would reopen the government. I have one of those bills right here. I've brought it to the floor in the past. It's a bill that would open 8 of the 9 federal departments that have nothing to do with the Homeland Security Department or border security or a wall. 8 of the 9 of them. This bill is sitting on the Senate calendar. We could vote on it today. And yet, the majority leader refuses to bring it up for a vote. And the great irony is this bill that is on the Senate calendar contains provisions that have already been supported in the United States Senate by overwhelming bipartisan majorities. A big part of this bill includes about 4 federal departments where we voted by 92-6 on the funding levels for the whole fiscal year until the end of September. In other cases, what's in this bill passed the Senate Appropriations Committee on a vote of 31-0 and another on a vote of 30-1. So why aren't we bringing up these bills? Now, the majority leader had said previously he wasn't going to bring up any bills in the United States Senate unless they were supported by President Trump and by the Democrats. You know what, Mr. President? That's an abdication of the responsibility of this Senate as a separate and co-equal branch of government. Since when do we say to this president or any president, we're not going to consider a piece of legislation on the floor of the Senate unless you tell us ahead of time you're good with it? That's not doing our job. That's not fulfilling our constitutional responsibility. We have an obligation to do our duty as a separate branch of government and vote, especially when it's on a piece of legislation the Senate's already voted on and already supported overwhelmingly on a bipartisan basis and would reopen the government. So instead of doing our job, we're going to contract out our responsibilities to the President of the United States. But apparently it's going to get worse, because now, as I understand it, the majority leader has changed his position. And now he will allow a vote on something in the Senate chamber, but guess what it is? It's on the President's proposal. So now, not only are we going to essentially say that we won't vote on something the President doesn't like, but now the one thing the majority leader says we will vote on is what the President wants. What the President wants. Well, you know what? I'm okay having a vote on the President's proposal, but if we're going to vote on that, my goodness, we should also vote on the bill that's already on the Senate calendar, that's already received strong bipartisan support in the United States Senate. So I do have a question for the majority leader. If we're going to be voting on President Trump's most recent proposal, are we also going to be able to have a vote on the bill that was already on the Senate calendar, that's already been supported by a bipartisan majority, that would reopen the government right away? That's my question. Because let's vote, and let's just see what happens. But let's vote on not just what the President of the United States wants to. Since when does the President dictate what we do here in the United States Senate? That's a question for every member. So I'm for voting, but I'm not for doing what appears to be about to happen, which is just say we're going to vote on what the President wants, and again, contracting out our responsibilities to the White House. Now, what we're seeing every day, as I said, is the growing damage from this shutdown. And I mentioned that small businesses are really feeling the pain. There's a story in the Wall Street Journal, headline, "Small Businesses $2 billion problem. Government shutdown leaves loans in limbo." And this is happening all over the country. What you're seeing is that businesses and startups and the engine of our economy are not able to access loans through the Small Business Administration. In fact, Mark Zandi of Moody's Analytics estimates that the shutdown has delayed the $2 billion in SBA lending. Jill Emerson, the CEO of an electrical components company in Tennessee, just heard that her lender shut down their $3 million line of credit. Quote, "Our frustration is unbelievable," she said. This is the CEO of an electrical components company in Tennessee. Quote, "To keep us alive, I am borrowing from business associates who have worked with us for years." We're hearing other small businesses that are just starved for lack of capital, others where the small business owners are personally guaranteeing loans. But for the most part, there are many that are just not getting the capital they need to open up their businesses, to sustain their businesses. And as a result, they're laying off workers. And that is a growing consequence of this shutdown. Now, I've shared on this floor many times some of the stories of federal employees who work in Maryland, and the fact that they want, first and foremost, to get back to work. Everywhere I go, even before people mention the fact that they're missing their paychecks, they tell me they want to get back to do the work for the American people. And then they do share really terrible stories, Mr. President, about how the lack of pay is impacting them more and more day by day. But beyond the stories that you'll hear from federal employees who work in my state of Maryland or Senator Kane's state of Virginia, and I want to thank Senator Kane for all his efforts to reopen the government, and of course federal employees in the District of Columbia, the reality is that 80% of federal employees live outside of this region. They live all over the country. I'm talking about Coast Guard officials, we're talking about TSA officials, we're talking about Homeland Security officials, we're talking about people in federal agencies that are scattered across this country. A former Marine, who's now an EPA employee in Kansas, is the primary breadwinner for her family and 2 children. Here's what she had to say the other day, quote, "To have to go to your landlord and say, 'I don't know how I'm going to pay you,' I've never had to do that." The president said people would, quote, "make adjustments." The president said he could, quote, "relate." Well, it's easy for the president to say. He is sort of jetting from the White House to Mar-a-Lago, to Trump Tower. And so those words are hollow to the millions of Americans who are actually really hurting. Here's what this federal worker in Kansas said, quote, "We're trying to cut the grocery bill down to the necessities. I mean, we don't live extravagantly, so it's hard to cut out any bills." And her children noticed, she said. She said, quote, "My son wants to sell art to pay our bills." Right now, all over the country, we have federal employees who are trying to take on odd jobs to make ends meet. Sometimes that takes startup costs, which, of course, they don't have because they don't have any income coming in the door. One story from Cadillac, Michigan, goes as follows. Deborah Ann Brabazon is a furloughed Forest Service worker. She said she's paying $100 to get fingerprinted and get background checked so she could get certified as a substitute teacher. She was down to eating 1 meal a day, and she didn't have the $100 to pay to get the fingerprinting and background check to get an odd job in order to bring out some income while she wasn't getting her federal paycheck. She said that she leapt to volunteer in exchange for grocery money, and that, quote, "I was a nanny in college. I'm falling back on everything I learned about how to survive." So, Mr. President, as we can see, as each day goes by, the pain grows. The pain grows on small businesses. The pain grows on families. And the Trump shutdown is also hurting our national security and creating growing harm to our national security by the day. The FBI Agents Association put out a report today on the impacts they're seeing. One agent says, quote, "I've been working on a long-time MS-13 investigation for over 3 years. We have indicted 23 MS-13 gang members. Since the shutdown, I have not had a Spanish speaker in the division. We have several Spanish-speaking informants. We are only able to communicate using a 3-way call with a linguist in another division." So the government shutdown is hurting the FBI's efforts to go after MS-13 gangs. Now, Mr. President, I often hear President Trump talking about the need to crack down on MS-13. And when it comes to MS-13, he's absolutely right. Long before the president even started talking about MS-13, many of us in this body and in the House of Representatives have been working to crack down on MS-13 gang violence. think the president just discovered MS-13 when he decided to run for president, but many of us have been working on that issue for a long time. And yet now the government shutdown is undermining that effort. Here's what another national security official says, quote, "Not being able to pay confidential human sources risks losing them and the information they provide forever. It is not a switch that we can turn on or off." So here's another FBI official indicating that the shutdown has shut off funds they use for critical informants to track down criminals. But apparently, that doesn't matter to President Trump. That effort is just another casualty of the shutdown he brought about. We're also seeing impacts on cybersecurity. Wired magazine reported last week, quote, "As the shutdown drags on, security risks intensify." The article notes that the new Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at the Department of Homeland Security is operating with a skeleton crew, risking government websites and systems. Quote, "Many websites have had their HTTPS encryption certificates expire during the shutdown, exposing them to potential snooping or even impersonator sites. And with most IT staff staying home, it seems unlikely that software patches and upgrades are being installed at their regular clip, potentially leaving them exposed to malware they'd otherwise be protected against." In other words, Mr. President, since President Trump has sent all these employees home without pay, they're not able to ensure that government computers are not kept up to date with the software they need to protect them against cyber attacks. And so this shutdown is leaving a lot of the U.S. government computer systems more vulnerable. And when that happens, it makes all of us more vulnerable. In addition, the private sector that relies in many ways on a public-private partnership with cybersecurity resources from the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, NIST, says that they are not able to access that information at this point in time. Those are just some of the more recent impacts that harm our national security. Interestingly, though, Mr. President, what we're seeing is that not everyone is hurting. It turns out that if you have friends in the Trump administration, you may be able to get some relief. I think many of us were interested last week when the mortgage industry was able to persuade the administration to bring back some employees from the IRS back to work. Here's what the mortgage industry said, quote, could you make these guys essential? Meaning some of the folks they wanted to bring back at the IRS. And you know what? In response to the mortgage industry, the White House brought more people back. Because according to the report, the shutdown was stalling an IRS process to confirm borrowers' incomes before they could grant home loans. And that, of course, is a problem for the mortgage industry in making those loans. So the Mortgage Bankers Association reached out to the Department of Treasury, and suddenly the Department of Treasury said, oh, that's an essential function. Mortgage industry wants it. We're going to bring back folks to process that information. The story quotes the chief executive of the Bankers Association saying, quote, I'd like to take some credit. Our direct request got quite rapid results. Now, Mr. President, I'm glad that people are getting their income checked through IRS validation so that they can get their mortgages. But the way to do this isn't to respond piecemeal to some powerful special interest. We shouldn't be playing favorites in this shutdown, and that's what we're seeing from this administration. The way to deal with it is obvious. Open up the government so that we can resume these functions. And here in the United States Senate, the fastest and best way to open up the government is to have a vote. To have a vote on the bill that's on the Senate calendar that's already received broad bipartisan support here in the United States Senate. Now I want to talk a minute about Homeland Security, because I believe the presiding officer knows, Mr. President, that the Trump administration requests for this portion of border security funding was $1.6 billion. That's what's in their budget. You can go look on their budget online. They requested $1.6 billion. I serve on the Senate Appropriations Committee, and the Senate Appropriations Committee provided that request. Provided that request for strengthening barriers. We did say that you can't use that money to build that sort of new huge wall the president used to talk about. But we provided $1.6 billion, and that was going to work out fine in the long run. And then, of course, in December, the president said, oh, I need this $5.7 billion for a big wall. Mr. President, I think all of us know who, follow these issues closely, that even before President Trump was elected, we had 700 miles of barriers and fencing along certain strategic parts of the border. And we have provided funds to reinforce and strengthen some of those barriers. And so this is a totally manufactured issue by the President of the United States in terms of all of a sudden demanding more funds than the President himself in his budget requested. So we should have a serious conversation on border security and immigration issues, and we can have it now, but what we cannot do is continue to allow the country to be held hostage through this government shutdown. And as I said at the beginning of my remarks, it was the President of the United States who said on December 11th of last year he'd be, quote, proud to shut down the government if he didn't get things his way. Well, that's just not how things work, especially not how things work in an era of divided government. And so I appeal to my colleagues, my Senate Republican colleagues, to work with us to find a way out. Obviously, the fastest way out is to vote on the bills that already have bipartisan support. But we should have a conversation. But what I do find, Mr. President, to be a very sad reflection on this body is if we move forward and have a vote only on the proposal the President of the United States wants, and not also a vote on the bill that previously had bipartisan support here in the United States Senate, because that would send an awful message. It would send the message that the majority party has allowed an independent, co-equal branch of government to be totally hijacked by the President of the United States, as opposed to doing our job as a separate branch of government under Article 1. If we're going to take the position that this Senate, with 53 Republicans and 47 Democrats, are only going to vote on a proposal from the President of the United States, then we simply become a vehicle, an agent for the President. And that would be a great shame on this body. And so if we're going to have a vote on that bill, and again, I'm fine to have a vote on that bill. We should have votes. In the light of day, we should have transparency and accountability. But what would be outrageous if we say, okay, we're going to vote only on the bill the President of the United States wants and not on another measure that has already received broad bipartisan support. That would be a dereliction of duty in the United States Senate as a separate and co-equal branch of government. Mr. President, let's end this shutdown. We have it in our power to vote now. Let's do our job. The President can do what he wants, but let's do our job under the Constitution, and let's do it and be held accountable by the American public. Let's not use procedural devices to only allow votes on what the President wants and not votes on bills that we voted on before. So I'm hoping that this Senate will do its job and do its duty and hold that vote to reopen government, and not just on the President's proposal, but on the other proposals as well. And in the meantime, we should continue to have serious conversations about the most effective and cost-effective way to provide border security and how we can deal with other immigration issues. But nobody should send the signal that shutting down the government is a good way to do business. I would hope that neither Republican or Democratic senators would want to send a signal to the executive that they're going to be rewarded for shutting down the government, now 32 days long. A real shame for the country and something that nobody should be proud of. No matter what the President of the United States says, this is nothing for anybody to be proud of. I suggest the absence of a quorum.